In June of 1999, detectives with the Rhode Island State Police were under a lot of pressure. They were investigating a disturbing case, one that had left the residents of a normally quiet seaside community completely terrified and on edge. What was worse, it appeared that they had now exhausted all of their leads, and they still had no idea who was responsible. Fortunately, in a last-ditch effort to uncover new evidence, investigators would return to the crime scene to have one last look for clues. It was here that they would find something that they had missed the first time. This discovery not only had deeply unsettling implications, it also gave police a key piece of information about the identity of their culprit. Information that they were about to use to unmask a brutal killer. At around 10 a.m. on May 30th, 1999, a woman named Sally Craig pulled up to a property in the small coastal town of Little Compton, Rhode Island. The residence belonged to her friend and co-worker, 66-year-old Angela Spence-Shaw. It was located off of a quiet two-lane stretch called Saconnet Point Road, just a stone's throw from the ocean. The house itself was set back from the roadway, further tucked away by multiple lines of trees, bushes, and other greenery. The kind of place that you might not even have known was there if it weren't for the well-worn dirt path made by countless passes of a vehicle. That Sunday morning, Sally was there to check up on Angela. The two of them were supposed to work together at Peckham's greenhouse about 5 miles away. However, Angela had failed to show up for her shift. This was unusual enough, but when the 66-year-old also didn't answer repeated phone calls, Sally and others had started to worry. Especially because Angela lived alone. As Sally came to the end of the long dirt driveway, she noticed that Angela's tan Ford Explorer was parked outside. Because of this, it seemed like she should be home, but when Sally knocked, no one came to the front door. After waiting a bit, Sally tried the doorknob, and to her surprise, discovered that the house was unlocked. She opened the door and called out several times, but no one replied. Worried that Angela might have had some kind of an accident, Sally headed a little further inside. When she did, she could hear a familiar noise. It sounded like running water, and it was coming from the second floor. At this point, Sally began making her way upstairs. The whole way, she continued to call out for Angela, but just like before, she wasn't getting any kind of acknowledgement. She finally figured out why, when she followed the source of the noise she was hearing all the way to the main second-floor bathroom. She opened the door just long enough to see the horrifying situation that was waiting on the other side. Angela was dead, and her body was submerged in her overflowing bathtub. The water was still running, and there was blood everywhere. Though officers from the Little Compton PD were the first ones to arrive at the scene, they quickly realized that the case was beyond the capabilities of their tiny department. Little Compton was a town of barely 3,300 people, with only 9 full-time officers on its staff. And after responding to Sally Craig's 911 call, all it took was a brief glimpse inside the bathroom to confirm that what had happened to Angela Spence-Shaw was no accident. She had clearly been the victim of a brutal attack. The situation was so bad that one of the first EMTs to arrive at the scene, a person who actually knew Angela, later said that she was unrecognizable. There was no doubt this was a homicide. When backup was called in from the Rhode Island State Police, detectives began by processing the upstairs bathroom where Angela Spence-Shaw had been found. As previously mentioned, the 66-year-old's body was submerged in her bathtub. She showed signs of having been badly beaten, though her exact cause of death wasn't immediately clear. Angela was dressed in a pink nightshirt, but it appeared that her clothing had been removed from the waist down. Another thing that stuck out was a hairdryer which had been plugged in and thrown into the tub while Angela was inside. Detectives theorized that this was either a lame attempt to cover up the crime to make it look like an accidental electrocution, or a chilling bit of extra insurance to make sure that the 66-year-old was dead. Both explanations were equally disturbing. As Angela's body was sent off for an autopsy, investigators turned their attention to her bedroom. Based on the blood evidence, it was obvious that this is where the attack had started. Specifically, there were puddles of blood around the room, as well as on the carpet and the doorframe leading to the bathroom. From the looks of it, there had actually been more, but whoever had done this had stripped and taken the sheets from Angela's bed. Even so, a spot of blood had soaked down into the mattress topper below, and a single pillow and pillowcase that had been left behind were also stained with blood. Piecing all of these details together, detectives concluded that Angela had likely been attacked while asleep in her bed. Judging by the wounds to her body, she had fought for her life, but had been overpowered. After the savage beating, the killer had dragged her into the bathroom, where they had finished her off. Though the details of how the crime unfolded seemed disturbingly straightforward, investigators were about to learn that the why behind it was a different story. Angela's house hadn't been ransacked, and other than the stripped and stolen bedsheets, nothing looked like it was out of place. In fact, at least $500 in cash that the 66-year-old kept in her wallet and in a ceramic box on her dresser had been left untouched. The same was true of her jewelry and other expensive items in the house. With obvious motives like burglary now ruled out, investigators started to wonder if they were dealing with something more personal in nature. In order to figure that out, though, they knew they were going to have to find out a whole lot more about Angela's life. After finishing up their initial analysis of the crime scene, detectives with the Rhode Island State Police moved on to interviewing everyone they could that was close to Angela Spence-Shaw. They began with the gut-wrenching task of contacting her two adult sons, Gerard and Justin, to deliver the heartbreaking news. Both men were understandably devastated to learn what had happened, but the situation came as a shock to Gerard in particular. He had just seen his mother the previous night, May 29th. That evening, Angela had come to his home in the town of Bristol, about 20 miles north of the crime scene. She had dinner with him, his wife, and their children. Gerard said that it had been a totally normal dinner. There was certainly no indication that when his mom had driven off that night, it'd be the last time he'd ever speak to her. This was incredibly tragic to think about, but it was also an important detail for police that significantly helped to construct a timeline. According to Gerard, his mother had left his house between 8:30 and 8:45 p.m. The most obvious route back to her house from Bristol would have been about a 30-minute drive, meaning that Angela likely got home somewhere between 9 and 9:15. Given that much of the blood in the bedroom was dry at the time Sally Craig found the body the next morning, this narrowed the window in which the murder took place to just a few hours, either late on May 29th or early on the 30th. In addition to this, Gerard and Justin were able to provide investigators with a detailed picture of their mother's life. Angela was born in England in the early 1930s and grew up in Southgate, a suburban area of North London. She had lived here until the mid-1970s, when she and her husband, Bernard Spence, decided to uproot their lives and move to the United States, after Bernard got a job with Texas Instruments. The couple settled in Norton, Massachusetts, where they eventually opened up a small store on the campus of Wheaton College. The business, which was called the Campus Shop, quickly became a hangout for both students and faculty members. A large part of this was Angela, who was known for her great personality and sense of humor. As one newspaper report we came across put it, everyone was, quote, drawn to her quick wit and mischievous sense of adventure. Understandably, Angela and Bernard became a staple of the college community over the following years. They became especially well known for their annual Christmas party, which they would spend days cooking to prepare for. The event was always highly anticipated and well attended by both students and faculty at the college. Sadly, things took a turn in 1984 when Bernard was diagnosed with cancer. He passed away shortly thereafter, leaving Angela and both of their sons behind. Angela eventually remarried a man named Peter Shaw, which is how she had ended up in Little Compton. Peter had been a member of the town's planning board and knew the area well, so it was a natural move. Though it seems the couple enjoyed their life there together. Sadly, Peter also passed away in 1991. For the last few years, Angela had lived in the house alone that they had purchased together on Saconnet Point Road. While this was certainly tragic, by all accounts, Angela was about as far from the stereotype of the lonely widow that you could imagine. I mean, for starters, she was only 66, but on top of that, she lived a pretty active life. When Angela wasn't spending time with her 4 grandchildren, she was usually busy with one of her many hobbies. She regularly rode horses at the stable she was a member of, enjoyed painting watercolors, drawing with pastels, and watching birds, and also volunteered at a local charity that provided clothes for those in need. By far, Angela's greatest passion in life, though, was gardening. In addition to keeping a lovingly tended garden of her own, the 66-year-old volunteered at an arboretum in Bristol, worked part-time at Peckham's greenhouse, and was an avid member of the Little Compton Garden Club. In fact, at the time of her death, Angela had recently been elected president of the club. If you're thinking that all of this sounds like the life of a sweet lady who didn't have an enemy in the world, well, you're not alone. No matter how many people detectives spoke with, they kept hearing more of the same about Angela. She was a beloved member of her community, had a lot of friends, and wasn't leading anything close to what you might call a risky lifestyle. In short, none of this was making any sense. However, some of that was about to change when investigators received some unsettling new information. That information came from the medical examiner's office, who called to share the results of Angela's autopsy. The findings showed that the 66-year-old had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and drowning. She had also been electrocuted by the hairdryer in the bathtub, though it was mainly the beating that had caused most of the damage to her body. Somehow, these injuries were even worse than authorities had initially suspected. Angela had suffered everything from broken ribs to multiple ruptured organs. Not only that, but the force of these injuries made it clear that she hadn't just been hit by the perpetrator. It looked as though the killer had actually stomped and jumped up and down on her during the savage attack. The final detail unearthed by the autopsy was no less brutal. Based on more injuries she had suffered and semen that was recovered from her remains, Angela had been the victim of a sexual assault. With this new evidence, detectives finally had a potential motive. They also now had the DNA of their killer, as the semen sample had immediately been sent away for analysis. The question still remained, though. Who could have been capable of a heinous crime like this? Rhode Island State Police started in the most obvious place and began looking through records of known offenders in the area that had committed similar crimes. They quickly zeroed in on a man who had previously been convicted of a violent sexually motivated attack. Police paid a visit to the man at his house, who agreed to come down to the local station for questioning. He provided a blood sample, but it turned out not to be a match to evidence at the crime scene. With that, he was ruled out. While this was a setback, it wasn't long before investigators turned their attention to a second person of interest, one whose criminal history was even more alarming. That man's name was Stanley Gendreau. The reason police were specifically interested in Stanley was because he was actually the person who had committed the last murder in Little Compton. Back on the night of April 21st, 1965, Senator Maxwell Huntoon and his wife were supposed to go to a fundraiser with their adult daughter and her husband. Since their daughter and her family were visiting from out of town, the Huntoons had arranged for a babysitter for their 3 young children. Her name was Anne Brownell, a local 18-year-old high school student. At first, the evening seemed to go as planned. However, when the adults returned from the fundraiser that night, they found the 3 children asleep on the living room couch instead of in their beds. When the children were woken up and asked what was going on, they said that they had been trying to wait up because they couldn't find their babysitter anywhere. A search was launched of the surrounding area, one that quickly took a dark turn when blood was found outside on the road. This blood actually formed a trail, and when police followed it with their flashlights, they made a terrible discovery. Anne's body had been left in an overgrown field across the street behind 2 vacant homes. She had been beaten to death with a rock. An investigation led to Stanley Gendreau, a 22-year-old carpenter who also lived in the area. According to one report we came across, Stanley's mom was the Huntoons' housekeeper. It turned out that Stanley had attended the same high school as Anne, and at some point had developed an obsession with her. That night, after the Huntoons and their daughter went out, Stanley showed up in his car. He began watching Anne from the windows outside, but eventually decided to take things further. After entering the house where she was babysitting through an unlocked back door, he held her at gunpoint and forced her to walk back out to his vehicle. There he tried to make advances towards her. Anne fought back and managed to escape the car, but Stanley caught up with her and attacked her with a rock. Now, Stanley had been convicted of Anne's murder, but he was granted parole in 1980. Nearly 20 years later, police wondered, was it possible that he had killed again? Right off the bat, the crimes had some obvious similarities. Both of the victims were women, both of them were beaten to death, and both crimes appeared to be sexually motivated. The similarities between the crimes weren't the only reason that detectives were interested in Stanley as a suspect, though. Even though it had been nearly 2 decades since Stanley had been released from prison, he still had ties to Little Compton. In fact, his parents lived right near Angela Spence-Shaw. When investigators went to speak with Stanley's parents, they said that he wasn't there, but he had been in town as of just a few days earlier. After hearing this, authorities went into overdrive trying to find Stanley Gendreau. They reached out to law enforcement in neighboring states, asking them to keep an eye out for him as well. It took a couple of days, but eventually Stanley was located. When the now 56-year-old sat down for questioning with Rhode Island police, the interview initially seemed promising. Stanley didn't have much of an alibi. He claimed that he was reading a book at the time of Angela's murder, but couldn't really provide anyone to back up his story. What Stanley was able to provide, though, was his DNA. To the surprise of state police, it wasn't a match to the evidence found with Angela's body. With their best lead now definitively ruled out, detectives were in a tough spot. It couldn't have come at a worse time either, as by now news of the murder was spreading rapidly. Understandably, people were concerned. Residents of Little Compton weren't used to violent crimes like this, so the idea that a killer might be loose in the small town had everyone on edge. With the case at a dead end, investigators decided to more or less start their investigation over. This would turn out to be a crucial move. You see, back where all of this had started, there was actually a detail that was hiding in plain sight, something that up until now had been overlooked. It was when police spotted this detail that things would finally start to fall into place. After deciding to essentially begin their investigation from scratch, detectives with the Rhode Island State Police started by heading back to the crime scene. Once there, they did another sweep of the residence, this time trying to keep an eye out for anything that they might have missed when they were there before. Eventually, someone on the team found something. So, shortly before Angela's death, she had hired a company to build an addition onto her home. The basic structure of the new addition had been completed, but the place was still very much an active construction site. None of the interior had been finished, most of the windows and doors hadn't been put in yet, there were piles of material around, stuff like that. Of course, investigators had seen the addition when they initially went inside to process the crime scene. It was pretty hard to miss, after all. But what they hadn't noticed was that the construction had started on the old part of the house as well. Specifically, a section of the wall had been removed, where the new addition was supposed to join the house. This meant that there was a hole in the exterior of Angela's home. A hole which had only been covered with a single piece of tarp. Unfortunately, none of the sources we came across showed pictures of the actual tarp, but if you look at these photos, which are taken from the inside of the unfinished new addition, you can see that this part is basically open to the elements. In other words, that piece of tarp was the only thing securing Angela's house. When police saw this, first of all, they couldn't believe that they had missed it, but second of all, they realized that this was potentially a huge deal for their case. Anyone who knew about the hole in Angela's home would have known that they could have gotten in at any time without leaving behind signs of forced entry, and that she would have been completely vulnerable. In terms of who would have known about the addition to Angela's house, there were really just 2 main groups of people. There were neighbors who had seen the construction happening. However, police had already spoken to most of them and ruled them out. Then, there were the workers from the company that were actually building the new addition. These were people that authorities hadn't yet questioned. At first, sitting down with all of the workers looked like it was going to be a pretty large undertaking. There was a crew of 30 people who worked for the company, all of whom had been at the property at one point or another. Fortunately, this is when detectives got another important break. It turned out that only 2 of the workers had actually cut the hole into the exterior wall of Angela's house. That had happened on May 28th, just 1 day before the murder. Upon learning this, authorities quickly got the names of these 2 workers, Kevin Chiquette and Jeremy Motika. Detectives sat down with Kevin and Jeremy individually and asked them about the night of May 29th. Both of them provided alibis. Kevin's story was extremely straightforward. He was with his girlfriend all night and hadn't gone anywhere. Jeremy had a little bit more to say, but nothing outwardly suspicious. He said he got off work that afternoon, then went home and had a few drinks. At some point, he went over to his neighbor's house where some teenagers were throwing a party. He said he stayed there all evening, continued drinking, and eventually went home and passed out pretty late. The next morning, he woke up and drove to Cape Cod, where his girlfriend was spending the Memorial Day weekend with her parents. Now, at first, both Kevin and Jeremy's alibis appeared to check out. Kevin's girlfriend confirmed that they had spent the entire night together on May 29th, and several people at the party that Jeremy had attended said that they remembered him being there that evening. However, a couple of these people also mentioned something interesting. The party had been broken up around midnight. This caught the attention of detectives, because when Jeremy told them about the party, he had made it sound like it went into the early hours of the morning, effectively covering the time during which Angela was murdered. Now, there was a gap in his alibi. Authorities uncovered more interesting information when they spoke with Jeremy's girlfriend, Patricia Rogalin. She said that Jeremy had been acting strangely in the lead up to the murder. First, on May 28th, he decided he wasn't going to come up to her parents' house in Cape Cod, saying that he didn't want to deal with the holiday traffic. This had annoyed Patricia, and the pair had exchanged a number of tense phone calls the following day. Patricia said that when she spoke to Jeremy on the evening of May 29th, he was angry and argumentative. He had also clearly been drinking, but not to the point that he wasn't making sense. The last time they had spoken that night was around 9:30 p.m. After being really stubborn about not wanting to come to Cape Cod, Patricia said that she was surprised when Jeremy suddenly showed up there the next morning. He was extremely hungover and spent most of the day in bed, and she said it seemed like something was bothering him. Needless to say, detectives were intrigued by this. Jeremy had left a ton of these details out of his version of events, and he also now had no explanation for where he was during Angela's murder. On top of this, Jeremy lived in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is right on the border with Rhode Island. His home was only around 20 miles from the crime scene, meaning he easily could have driven there and back that night. At this point, investigators decided to sit down with Jeremy for a second interview. This time, he offered more details about his activities on the night of May 29th, though interestingly, these were still different than the ones that police had already been told. It was also pretty obvious that they were made up. For instance, Jeremy now said that he had stopped at a bar on the way home from work that afternoon, but claimed he couldn't remember what it was called. He also said that he had ordered pizza from a local Domino's that evening. Police checked with the restaurant, who said that they did have a record of an order, but it had been made the night before May 28th. While it was clear that Jeremy was hiding something, detectives decided that they didn't have enough to move the case forward just yet. As luck would have it, they were about to get exactly what they needed. A few days after their second interview with Jeremy, police got a call. It was from Kevin Chiquette, who said that he had something he wanted to share with them. Kevin said that ever since he and the rest of the construction crew had been interviewed about Angela's murder, Jeremy had been acting really strangely at work. For days, he had been talking non-stop about the case, and he seemed extremely paranoid about the whole thing. At first, Kevin kind of understood where Jeremy was coming from. Obviously, no one wants to be questioned in connection with an awful crime like this, so Kevin had done his best to reassure Jeremy. He basically said, look man, you don't have anything to worry about. We were never even in the part of the house where the murder happened. But when Kevin said this, Jeremy had a really strange reply. He claimed that actually, he had been secretly using Angela's upstairs bathroom while they were on the job site. Kevin thought this was really weird. I mean, first of all, he had never seen Jeremy go upstairs while they were working on Angela's house. And also, if he was going to use any bathroom, why use the one on the second floor? That wasn't even the strangest part, though. So, at least one time after the murder had happened, the construction crew apparently returned to Angela's house. Reports don't really give any details about why this was the case, but suffice it to say by this point the place was an active crime scene. According to Kevin, while there, a bunch of the workers had noticed a police evidence box outside labeled shoe impressions. Of course, Jeremy was one of the people who had seen this, and he began to talk obsessively about it afterwards. Specifically, he kept going on about how shoe impressions meant nothing because so many people have the same shoe prints. He also said that he was convinced that police were trying to pin the crime on him because of his criminal record. Speaking of Jeremy's criminal record, shortly before the call from Kevin, detectives had actually run a background check on him. What they found was pretty alarming. It turned out that at the time of Angela's murder, Jeremy was out on bail for a crime in Massachusetts. In October of 1997, he had allegedly hidden in a woman's car when she went inside a convenience store in the village of Hyannis. When the woman got back into the vehicle, he was accused of grabbing her from behind and ordering her to drive away. She had managed to escape by pulling into a restaurant parking lot and jumping out. For this, Jeremy had been charged with kidnapping, carjacking, and assault and battery, though the case had yet to go to trial. Needless to say, all of this looked pretty bad for Jeremy, but things were about to get even worse. When detectives spoke with his girlfriend Patricia a second time, they learned that in the days immediately following Angela's murder, he had been trying to convince her to get rid of the work boots he wore for his construction job. Out of nowhere, he became very insistent that she should take them to her parents' house, though really didn't have a reason as to why. Of course, police understood, thanks to that phone call from Kevin. Jeremy was paranoid that police had found his footprints at the crime scene. At this point, investigators brought Jeremy in for one final interview, during which they asked for a sample of his DNA. He said yes, voluntarily agreeing to hand over a sample.
The next witness statement will be dated June 9th, 1999.
My name is Jeremy Motika, October 10th, 1975.
Mr. Motika, prior to signing a release for hospital blood, were you advised of your constitutional rights?
Yes.
And you understand the reason that you are providing a blood sample to the Rhode Island State Police, is that correct?
Correct.
And you're doing so on your own free will?
Correct.
The sample took a couple of weeks to process, but later that month, the results came back. It showed that Jeremy Motika's DNA was a match to the semen found with Angela Spence-Shaw's body. After being arrested on June 25th, Jeremy attempted to offer a pretty wild explanation for the DNA evidence. He claimed that he would often get intimate with his girlfriend before work, but for some reason would wait until he got to work to wash himself off inside Angela Spence-Shaw's bathtub. When no one believed this, he switched his story, going back to saying that police were falsifying evidence and trying to frame him. In February of 2001, following a trial, Jeremy Motika was convicted of the first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault of Angela Spence-Shaw. 2 months later, he received the maximum penalty of life without parole on both counts, in large part due to the complete lack of remorse he showed. Unfortunately, because Jeremy never offered any kind of confession, sadly, we may never know why he killed Angela. Police had their theory, though. Simply because he could. They argued that Jeremy knew Angela lived alone and was vulnerable, and on the night of May 29th, 1999, drove to her house with the full intent of attacking her while drunk. He then specifically tried to cover up the crime in a lame attempt to make it look like an accident. All that being said, I should point out that Jeremy has continued to maintain his innocence since his conviction, and has also continued to appeal. In 2017, a court ruled that he had the right to a new evidentiary hearing. It's unclear what has become of this since, but as of the time of this recording, Jeremy remains incarcerated at the Rhode Island Maximum Security Prison in the city of Cranston. I don't think it will come as a shock to anyone, but the sheer brutality of this one really got to me. Not only that, but to do something like this to someone and then to offer no kind of explanation as to why is truly chilling. I mean, there really is no explanation that could make something like this justified or understandable, but you get what I mean. I guess I shouldn't be that surprised at the same time, though, since Jeremy's first move after this was to drive to Cape Cod to try and enjoy his Memorial Day weekend. At the time of this recording, it's been almost exactly 25 years since this terrible crime took place. And what I find especially tragic is that this is all time that Angela's family could have enjoyed with her. She was only 66 when she was killed, after all, so it's not inconceivable that had this never happened, she still could have been with them today. Wherever her family is, I sincerely hope that they are doing well and that they are doing their best to keep Angela's memory alive. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.